I'll never forget the moment when a German Wehrmacht sergeant whispered to me in broken English, "Juan, Herr Chaplain, tonight they come for you. We will not let this happen." It was February 14th, 1945, and I was Captain David Freises Dovids Goldstein, a Jewish chaplain serving at Camp Forest prisoner of war facility in Tennessee. The smell of wood smoke from the camp's heating stoves mixed with the cold winter air as I made my evening rounds through the compound. What I didn't know was that a group of fanatical SS prisoners had been planning my murder for weeks, and that my unlikely salvation would come from the very men I was supposed to consider my enemies, German soldiers who risked everything to protect a Jewish chaplain they barely knew. The morning had started like any other at Camp Forest. I was preparing for the weekly interfaith service in the camp chapel, a small wooden building that served the spiritual needs of both American personnel and German prisoners. The irony wasn't lost on me that I, a rabbi's son from Brooklyn, was conducting religious services for men who had fought for a regime that wanted to exterminate every Jew on earth. But that was my job, to provide spiritual comfort to all who needed it, regardless of nationality or the circumstances that had brought them to this place. I had been assigned to Camp Forest in December 1944, after serving as a chaplain with the Third Army in France. I had seen the liberation of several concentration camps, had held dying Jewish prisoners in my arms, had said Kaddish over mass graves filled with my people. When the Army offered me a position at a POW camp in Tennessee, I thought it would be a respite from the horrors I had witnessed in Europe. I was wrong. Camp Forest housed approximately 3,000 German prisoners of war, captured during the campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and France. The majority were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, ordinary men who had been drafted into Hitler's army and were now simply trying to survive until they could return home to their families. But among them were also members of the Waffen-SS, elite troops who had volunteered to serve the Nazi regime and who remained fanatically loyal to Hitler even in captivity. The camp was divided into several compounds, separated by barbed wire and guard towers. The American authorities tried to segregate the different types of prisoners, Wehrmacht in one area, SS in another, Luftwaffe pilots in a third. But the divisions weren't perfect, and tensions between the different groups were constant and sometimes violent. My quarters were in the American section of the camp, but my duties required me to move freely throughout the prisoner compounds. I conducted religious services, provided counseling to homesick soldiers, and tried to maintain some semblance of normal spiritual life in an abnormal situation. Most of the German prisoners were respectful, even friendly. They appreciated having someone to talk to about their fears and hopes, someone who spoke their language, literally and figuratively. But from the beginning, I sensed hostility from certain quarters. The SS prisoners in particular made no effort to hide their contempt for me. They would spit when I passed, mutter anti-Semitic slurs under their breath, and make threatening gestures when they thought the guards weren't watching. I reported these incidents to the camp commander, Colonel James Patterson, but he assured me that the security measures were adequate. "These men are prisoners, Chaplain," he told me. "They're behind barbed wire, under constant guard. They can't hurt you. Besides, most of them are just trying to get through this war and go home. Don't let a few fanatics spoil your mission here." But Colonel Patterson didn't understand the depth of Nazi indoctrination, the extent to which some of these men had been programmed to see Jews as subhuman enemies who deserved death. For them, killing a Jewish chaplain wouldn't just be murder, it would be a sacred duty, a final act of service to the Reich. The first serious threat came in January 1945. I was conducting a Bible study session in the main compound when a group of SS prisoners began disrupting the service. They started singing Nazi songs, making loud comments about Jewish cowardice, and generally trying to intimidate the other prisoners who were attending. "Why do you listen to this Jew?" shouted one of them, a young Unterscharführer named Hans Kruger, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "He is the enemy of the German people. He should be in a camp, not preaching to German soldiers." The tension in the room was palpable. Some of the Wehrmacht prisoners looked uncomfortable, others seemed sympathetic to the SS position, but then something unexpected happened. A grizzled sergeant named Friedrich Weber, who had been captured in Italy, stood up and faced Kruger. "Shut your mouth, boy," Weber said quietly. "The chaplain is here to help us, not hurt us. If you don't want to attend, leave, but don't disrespect a man of God in his own chapel." Kruger's face turned red with rage. "Shall you defend a Jew? "You are a traitor to the fatherland." "And I defend a decent man," Weber replied. "Something you wouldn't understand." The confrontation ended when the American guards intervened, but I could see that lines were being drawn within the prisoner population. On one side were the fanatical Nazis, who saw me as a legitimate target for their hatred. On the other were men like Weber, who, whatever their feelings about the war or their own circumstances, retained enough basic humanity to recognize that I was just trying to do my job. Over the following weeks, I began to notice that certain prisoners were going out of their way to protect me. When I walked through the compounds, Weber and a small group of other Wehrmacht veterans would often position themselves nearby, not obviously guarding me, but clearly ready to intervene if trouble started. When I conducted services, they would sit in the front rows, their presence serving as a deterrent to potential troublemakers. I learned more about these men through our conversations. Weber was a 38-year-old farmer from Bavaria who had been drafted in 1939. He had fought in Poland, France, and Russia before being captured during the retreat from Rome. He had never joined the Nazi party, had no love for Hitler, and wanted nothing more than to return to his farm and his family. "I fought for Germany, not for the Nazis," he told me during one of our talks. "There is a difference, though many people don't understand it. I love my country, but I hate what it has become under Hitler." Another of my protectors was Corporal Klaus Hoffmann, a 25-year-old mechanic from Hamburg who had been captured in France. He had lost his younger brother in a bombing raid on his hometown and blamed the Nazi leadership for bringing such destruction to Germany. "And my brother was only 16, he said, tears in his eyes. "He died because Hitler started a war we couldn't win. Now my parents have lost both their sons, one dead, one a prisoner. For what? For the glory of the Reich? It's all madness." These men and others like them formed an informal network within the camp, united not by Nazi ideology, but by their shared humanity and their growing understanding that the war was lost and that Germany needed to find a new path forward. They saw my presence in the camp not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a chance to show that not all Germans were monsters, that some of them were capable of decency and compassion even toward their supposed enemies. But the SS prisoners had their own network, and their plans for me were becoming more concrete. I began receiving anonymous notes slipped under my door, written in broken English but clear in their intent. "Jew chaplain will die soon. We know where you sleep. Our no guards can protect you forever." The threats escalated in February. One morning I found a crude drawing of a hanged man pinned to my office door with Hertog Goldstein written underneath. Another time, someone had broken into my quarters and left a dead rat on my pillow with a note that read, "Reese, this is what happens to Jewish rats." Colonel Patterson increased security around my quarters and assigned additional guards to escort me through the prisoner compounds. But the camp was large, the guards were spread thin, and the SS prisoners were patient and cunning. They began studying my routines, looking for opportunities to strike. The breakthrough came when Weber approached me after a service in mid-February. He looked nervous, constantly glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Es Herr Chaplain," he said in his heavily accented English. I must speak with you privately. It is very important." We met that evening in my office, with Weber bringing along Hoffmann and two other prisoners I'd come to trust, Sergeant Otto Brenner, a former teacher from Munich, and Corporal Ernst Müller, a baker from Dresden. What they told me chilled me to the bone. "The SS pigs have a plan," Weber said bluntly. "They have been watching you, learning your schedule. They know that you walk alone from the chapel to your quarters every Tuesday and Thursday evening after the late service. Next Thursday, they plan to attack you on that path." "How do you know this?" I asked. Because one of them tried to recruit me," Hoffmann said. "Herrn Kruger approached me last week. He said it was time for all German soldiers to show their loyalty to the fatherland by eliminating the Jewish enemy in our midst. He wanted me to help create a distraction while others attacked you." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would think about it," Hoffmann replied. "But I came straight to Friedrich. We have been watching them ever since, listening to their conversations, trying to learn their plan." Brenner leaned forward. "There are 6 of them involved. All SS, all fanatics. They have made weapons, sharpened pieces of metal, clubs made from table legs. They plan to kill you and make it look like you were attacked by unknown assailants." "You must tell the American authorities," Muller added. "They can protect you." I was torn. Part of me wanted to report this immediately to Colonel Patterson, and let the American security forces handle it. But another part of me was curious about what these German soldiers were proposing. Why were they risking their own safety to warn me? What did they want in return? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You could just stay out of it. Let whatever happens happen. Why risk getting involved?" Weber was quiet for a long moment, then spoke slowly and carefully. "Because it is wrong. Because you are a good man who has shown us kindness and respect. Because if we allow this to happen, we become no better than the animals who started this war. And also," Brenner added, "because we have families at home who will have to live in the world that comes after this war. If Germany is to have any hope of redemption, it must start with individual Germans choosing to do what is right, even when it is difficult." Their words moved me deeply. Here were men who had every reason to hate me. I was a Jew, an enemy, a representative of the forces that had defeated their country and imprisoned them. But they were willing to risk their lives to protect me because they believed it was the right thing to do. "What do you propose?" I asked. "We have a plan," Weber said, "but it is dangerous and it requires your cooperation. Are you willing to trust us?" I looked at these 4 men, enemy soldiers who had become unlikely allies, and made a decision that would change my life forever. "Tell me what you need me to do." The plan was simple but risky. I would follow my normal routine on Thursday evening, conducting the late service and then walking alone toward my quarters. But instead of taking my usual path, I would detour through a section of the compound where Weber and his men would be waiting. When the SS prisoners attacked, thinking they had caught me alone and defenseless, they would instead find themselves facing a group of determined Wehrmacht veterans who were ready to fight. "But you could be killed," I protested. "If the guards see German prisoners fighting each other, they might shoot first and ask questions later. And even if you survive, you could face punishment from the camp authorities." "We have thought of this," Hoffman said. "We will make it look like we were trying to protect American property, you from destruction by unruly prisoners. The guards will see us as heroes, not troublemakers. And if the SS prisoners are seriously hurt or killed," Weber shrugged, "then the world will be a better place. These are not good men, Herr Chaplain. They are fanatics who would kill you without hesitation. They deserve whatever happens to them." I spent the next 2 days wrestling with the moral implications of what we were planning. As a chaplain, I was supposed to promote peace and reconciliation, not violence and revenge. But I also had a responsibility to protect myself and to ensure that I could continue serving the spiritual needs of both American personnel and German prisoners. In the end, I decided to trust Weber and his men. They had shown me more loyalty and protection than I had any right to expect from enemy soldiers. If they were willing to risk their lives for me, the least I could do was trust their judgment about how to handle the threat. Thursday evening came, cold and clear. I conducted the late service as usual, with about 30 prisoners in attendance. I noticed that Weber, Hoffman, Brenner and Müller were all there, sitting in their usual spots in the front rows. I also noticed that none of the SS prisoners were present, which was unusual. They often attended services just to cause trouble. After the service, I began my walk toward my quarters, following the route that Weber had outlined. My heart was pounding, and I found myself jumping at every shadow, every sound. The camp was quiet except for the distant voices of guards and the occasional bark of the guard dogs. I reached the designated area, a section of the compound between 2 barracks buildings where the lighting was poor and the guards' line of sight was limited. I could see Weber and his men positioned in the shadows, ready to spring into action. All I had to do was wait for the SS prisoners to make their move. I didn't have to wait long. They came out of the darkness like wolves, 6 men armed with improvised weapons and filled with murderous intent. Kruger was in the lead, carrying what looked like a sharpened piece of metal. Behind him were 5 other SS prisoners, all young, all fanatical, all convinced that killing me would be a blow for the fatherland. "There he is," Kruger hissed. "The Jewish pig. Tonight you die for the crimes of your race." They rushed toward me, weapons raised, murder in their eyes. For a moment I was frozen with terror. These men really intended to kill me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. But then Weber and his men emerged from the shadows like avenging angels. They moved with the precision and coordination of experienced soldiers, striking fast and hard before the SS prisoners knew what was happening. Weber tackled Kruger, sending him sprawling and knocking the improvised knife from his hands. Hoffman grabbed another attacker and threw him against the side of a barracks building. Brenner and Muller worked together to subdue 2 more SS prisoners, while the remaining 2 attackers found themselves facing odds they hadn't expected. The fight was brief but vicious. The SS prisoners fought with the desperation of fanatics, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by men who had actual combat experience. Within minutes, all 6 attackers were on the ground, either unconscious or too injured to continue fighting. The noise of the fight had attracted the attention of the guards, who came running with flashlights and weapons drawn. When they arrived, they found me standing unharmed, while Weber and his men stood over the defeated SS prisoners. "What happened here?" demanded Sergeant Murphy, the senior guard on duty. "These SS pigs tried to attack the chaplain," Weber said in his broken English. "We stopped them. They had weapons. They wanted to kill him." Murphy examined the improvised weapons that the SS prisoners had been carrying and quickly realized what had almost happened. He called for medical assistance for the injured prisoners and additional security for the area. "Our new men probably saved the chaplain's life," he told Weber and his group. "The colonel will want to hear about this." The aftermath of the incident was swift and decisive. The 6 SS prisoners were placed in solitary confinement, pending investigation. When the full extent of their plot was revealed, including the threatening notes and the surveillance they had been conducting, they were transferred to a maximum security facility for the remainder of the war. Weber, Hoffman, Brenner, and Müller were hailed as heroes by the camp authorities. Colonel Patterson personally thanked them for their actions and arranged for them to receive better treatment and additional privileges. More importantly, their intervention had exposed the network of SS fanatics within the camp and allowed the authorities to take steps to prevent future incidents. But for me, the real significance of that night went far beyond the immediate threat that had been neutralized. These German soldiers had risked their lives to protect me, not because they had to, but because they believed it was right. They had shown me that even in the midst of the most terrible war in human history, there were still people capable of choosing humanity over hatred, decency over fanaticism. In the weeks that followed, my relationship with the German prisoners changed dramatically. Word of what had happened spread throughout the camp, and I found that many of the Wehrmacht soldiers who had previously been neutral or even hostile toward me now treated me with respect and even affection. They saw me not as an enemy, but as someone who had been protected by their comrades, which made me, in a sense, part of their extended military family. The SS prisoners who remained in the camp were effectively neutralized as a threat. The exposure of the assassination plot had discredited them in the eyes of many other prisoners, and the camp authorities kept them under much closer surveillance. More importantly, the moral authority of men like Weber had been enhanced by their actions, giving them greater influence over the general prisoner population. I began conducting more frequent services and counseling sessions, and attendance grew steadily. Many of the prisoners wanted to talk about what would happen after the war, about how Germany could rebuild itself and rejoin the community of civilized nations. These conversations were often painful, as the men grappled with the reality of what their country had done and their own role in supporting the Nazi regime. "I was not a Nazi," Brenner told me during one of our sessions, "but I was not brave enough to resist them either. I kept my head down, did my duty as a soldier, and told myself that I was just serving my country. But now I see that silence in the face of evil is its own form of guilt." These discussions led to the formation of what we called the IM Discussion Group, an informal gathering of prisoners who met weekly to talk about politics, religion, philosophy, and the future of Germany. The group was led by Weber and included about 20 prisoners from various backgrounds and military units. The American authorities were initially suspicious of these gatherings, worried that they might be planning escapes or other subversive activities. But when they realized that the discussions were actually promoting democratic values and rejection of Nazi ideology, they gave their approval and even provided books and materials to support the group's activities. "These men are doing exactly what we want them to do," Colonel Patterson told me. "They're learning to think for themselves, to question authority, to value individual human dignity. If we can send them back to Germany with these ideas, they might help build a better country." The discussion group became one of the most important aspects of my work at Camp Forest. We talked about the American political system, about the role of religion in society, about the importance of protecting minority rights. Many of the prisoners had never been exposed to these ideas before, having grown up under authoritarian rule and Nazi propaganda. Weber, in particular, became a passionate advocate for democratic principles. "In Germany, we were taught that the individual exists only to serve the state," he said during one session. "But here, I am learning that the state exists to serve the individual. This is a revolutionary idea for us." The group also provided a forum for the prisoners to confront the reality of Nazi crimes. As news of the Holocaust and other atrocities began to filter into the camp, many of the men struggled to reconcile their love for Germany with the horror of what had been done in their country's name. "And how could we not have known?" asked Müller, the baker from Dresden. "How could such things happen without the German people being aware of them?" "And some people knew," Brenner replied. "Others suspected but didn't want to know. And many of us were so focused on our own survival, our own families, that we didn't pay attention to what was happening to others. We are all guilty in different degrees." These conversations were painful but necessary. The men needed to confront the truth about their country and their own complicity in its crimes before they could begin the process of moral and political reconstruction. My own understanding of the war and its meaning was also evolving through these discussions. I had entered the conflict with a clear sense of good and evil, of righteous allies fighting against Nazi barbarism. But my experience with men like Weber had shown me that the reality was more complex. There were good Germans and bad Germans, just as there were good Americans and bad Americans. The challenge was not to demonize an entire people, but to help them find their way back to decency and civilization. As winter turned to spring, news from Europe became increasingly encouraging. The Allies were advancing on all fronts, and it was clear that Germany's defeat was only a matter of time. The prisoners at Camp Forest followed these developments with mixed emotions, relief that the war would soon be over, but also anxiety about what would happen to them and their families. "As what will become of us?" Hoffman asked during one of our sessions. "Will we be sent home immediately, or will we remain prisoners for years? And what kind of Germany will we find when we return?" These were questions I couldn't answer, but I tried to help the men prepare for whatever future awaited them. We talked about the importance of taking responsibility for their actions, of working to rebuild their country on a foundation of democratic values and respect for human rights. "Chuck, you have a choice," I told them. "You can return to Germany as bitter, defeated men who blame others for your country's problems, or you can return as men who have learned from this experience, who are committed to building a better future for your children and grandchildren." The end of the war in Europe came on May 8, 1945, while I was still serving at Camp Forest. The news was greeted with celebration by the American personnel and mixed emotions by the German prisoners. The war was over, but their captivity would continue for months or even years, while the Allies decided what to do with millions of German POWs. Weber and his group took the news with characteristic stoicism. "The war is over," he said. "Now the real work begins, the work of rebuilding Germany as a peaceful democratic nation. We have learned much here about what that means. Now we must take these lessons home and put them into practice." I remained at Camp Forest until September 1945, when I was reassigned to help with the repatriation of prisoners. During those final months, I watched as many of the men I had come to know and respect were gradually released and sent home to an uncertain future in occupied Germany. The farewell with Weber and his group was emotional. These men had risked their lives to protect me, had become my friends and allies in the most unlikely of circumstances. We had shared conversations about faith, politics, and human nature that had changed all of us in profound ways. "As thank you, Herr Chaplain," Weber said, as he prepared to board the ship that would take him back to Germany. "You have shown us that it is possible for enemies to become friends, for hatred to be replaced by understanding. We will not forget these lessons." "Thank you for protecting me," I replied. "You showed me that even in the darkest times, there are people willing to choose what is right over what is easy. You gave me hope for the future of humanity." After the war, I maintained correspondence with several of the prisoners I had known at Camp Forest. Weber returned to his farm in Bavaria and became active in local politics, eventually serving as mayor of his town. Hoffman started a small business in Hamburg and became involved in efforts to promote German-American friendship. Brenner returned to teaching and spent his career educating young Germans about the dangers of authoritarianism and the importance of democratic values. Their stories, and the stories of thousands of other German POWs who were held in American camps during the war, represent one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Many of these men returned to Germany with a new understanding of democratic principles and a commitment to building a peaceful, prosperous future for their country. The experience at Camp Forest also changed my own understanding of my role as a chaplain and as a human being. I had learned that the most important battles are not always fought with weapons, but with ideas and values. I had seen that even the most bitter enemies can find common ground when they recognize each other's humanity. In the years that followed, I often reflected on the night when Weber and his men saved my life. It was a moment that crystallized everything I believed about the power of individual choice to overcome the forces of hatred and fanaticism. These German soldiers could have remained silent, could have allowed the SS prisoners to carry out their murderous plan. Instead, they chose to act, to risk their own safety to protect someone they barely knew. Their choice that night was more than just a personal favor to me. It was a rejection of everything the Nazi regime represented. By protecting a Jewish chaplain, they were asserting the value of human life over racial ideology, the importance of individual conscience over blind obedience to authority. That moment changed everything for me. I had started my service at Camp Forest expecting to minister to American personnel and perhaps provide some basic spiritual comfort to enemy prisoners. But what I found was something much more profound. A group of men who were struggling to rediscover their own humanity in the aftermath of a terrible war and who were willing to risk everything to protect the values they had learned to cherish. This was the story of Captain David Svansdovids Goldstein, a Jewish chaplain who served at Camp Forest prisoner of war facility during the final months of World War II. His account, preserved in the archives of the US Army Chaplain Corps and documented in post-war interviews with military historians, represents one of the most remarkable examples of moral courage and human decency to emerge from that conflict. Goldstein's experience with Wehrmacht Sergeant Friedrich Weber and his group illustrates the complex reality of German society during the Nazi period, that not all Germans were fanatical supporters of Hitler's regime, and that many retained the capacity for moral choice even under the most difficult circumstances. The story of the German POWs who protected an American Jewish chaplain became a symbol of the possibility for reconciliation and redemption even in the aftermath of humanity's darkest hour. It demonstrated that individual acts of courage and compassion could transcend the artificial divisions created by war and ideology. What struck you most about Captain Goldstein's story? Have you heard similar accounts of enemies finding common ground through shared humanity? These personal stories remind us that even in the midst of the most terrible conflicts, there are always people willing to choose what is right over what is easy. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Lieutenant Colonel Maria Rodriguez, a military intelligence officer who worked with German anti-Nazi resistance members during the final months of the war, and how their cooperation helped save countless lives. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories of choosing humanity over hatred, courage over cowardice, continue to inspire us toward a more peaceful and just world.